All right, just before we start, I'd just like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Just pay respects to their elders past, present, and importantly, emerging. So these proceedings take place in the spirit of reconciliation with those people. All right, we've got a great session today. We're going to have a discussion around Adapt, which is a great new book put out by Hannah, Louis and Cameron Logan, and we have both Hannah and Cameron talking. We also have Marika Nistupni, I'll probably pronounce that wrong, coming in from NMBW to talk as well. We have quite a bit of experience in Retrofit, so we will discuss everything in that book. It consists of a whole lot of great essays on Retrofit and some really good examples across really good architects in Australia. Already it's keeping its way into the studios and curriculum in Melbourne Uni, so it's good to see. We will talk for, as usual, 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we will have some question time after that, and I'll probably call it short a little bit just to do the rounds of what's happening in Retrofit around Melbourne and give a bit of an update on that. And hopefully finish by 5 o'clock. So with that, we might just launch straight into it, Hannah.
Yeah. Thanks.
So Hannah, I should have done a proper introduction. Hannah is a professor at Melbourne School of Design and Architecture, Building and Planning, and co-author with Cameron, who's up at the University of Sydney of the book. Do you want to say a bit more about your background, Hannah, if you like?
That's good. Thanks for coming, everybody online. Hope you can hear okay. So I'm going to introduce the book that Cameron and I wrote, also with contributions from Robert Crawford, Benes Absnabor, Christina Candido and Kirsten Thompson, and many other practices in putting the book together, which is this book here, published by Euro Books. And yeah, it's great to, so I'm going to give an overview of the book and work through, I guess, some of the issues very briefly. I'm going to hand to Cameron, who is going to talk about particularly some issues in one of the essays around some of the tensions in adaptive reuse and heritage and planning policy. And then, as Brendan said, Marika Nistupni from NMBW, who's one of the practices that we featured in the book, she can't come till 4:30, but she's going to give a case study, not of the two projects which we profiled in the book of theirs, but of something that is reasonably current, which will be great. It says, should I unmute Enzo, the host?
That's okay. They can hear through the...
Okay, so we're all right. Yeah, okay, great. So the book aims to showcase, I guess, persuasive arguments for adaptive reuse as a sort of vital design and development strategy in Australia in the 21st century. And I know sort of talking about all this is probably like bringing coal to Newcastle for the Retrofit Forum, but we're very much in that about stable of aims to be discussing this more broadly, particularly with a broader general and professional audience. And the first part of the book consists of 4 expert essays, and each of these essays in a way reconsiders conceptions of value, if you like, of how do we think about historic sites from multidisciplinary lenses, but reflective of a sort of diverse array of expertise needed to effectively embrace adaptive reuse as a design, construction and heritage and sustainability strategy going forward. And the title of the book, Adapt, Designing New Lives for Old Buildings, we sort of wanted to intentionally draw on a legacy of other books about adaptive reuse, but also highlight examples and a whole discussion around this that's particular to Australia, because the most seminal books in the field really, and both Cameron and I are historians, so this is where we start from in a way, is looking back at what have other people said about this. And the seminal international books include Servan Cantacuzino's book, New Uses for Old Buildings, published in 1975. And his later revision of that, where he updated it, called Re-Architecture, Old Buildings and New Uses of 1989. And that book really featured many influential European projects from the 1980s, you know, to say that this work has been going on not just recently, but it is part of the history of contemporary architecture. So, you know, buildings like the Musée d'Orsay in Paris by Gaël Lenti, the Tate work by James Sterling, a whole lot of sort of iconic things from the 1980s that did deal with taking an existing structure and adapting it for new use. In Australia, the National Trust, together with Peter Lovell and others, wrote the book New Uses for Old Buildings in Australia in 1982. And that's the first time that really the local context was addressed in this way. And so we are kind of intentionally riffing off those, but we also wanted to replace the word uses for designing new lives in the title as a kind of conscious decision to move away from focusing solely on changes of use and function and towards seeing adaptive reuse across a real continuum of a spectrum of change, whether that's through use, through modes of ownership and occupation, through ways of valuing, re-evaluating existing buildings and for updating their performance. So change in a whole spectrum of ways. And the other thing that our motivation was from the beginning that there are quite a lot of publications and guidelines on adaptive reuse in Australia and internationally that really deal with fairly celebrated monuments of sort of high formal heritage protection and recognition. And the sort of capital H heritage, as we like to call it, was fairly adequately covered. So what we thought was far less certain was this sort of myriad of places that make up the existing character and morphology of our urban, suburban and regional areas. They're typically quite substantial buildings physically. They're of some historic material or civic value, but they often don't necessarily meet the thresholds of heritage protection. So that was our sort of focus and our remit, if you like. And so the first of these 4 essays in the structure of the book, you have essays, and then I'll just very briefly walk through the case study section before I hand over to Cameron. But the first essay, called Adaptive Reuse in the Australian Context, really does examine the design strategies and approaches in the context of recent history of Australian architecture. So we really wanted to locate adaptive reuse squarely within mainstream practice rather than siloed out into the domain of heritage and conservation, which Cameron and I both sort of teach into. And this is really happening already, obviously, in practice. It's really interesting just to see the current awards nominations that came out yesterday or a couple of days ago, and the chair of the awards panel saying adaptive reuse features in so many categories this time. And we look back through all the awards to kind of think about our case studies, and it was really interesting charting whether it was its own category, whether it was logged in with heritage, whether it was kind of in interiors. So it's sort of it's interesting to see that it's pervading kind of all categories now. And we conducted a series of interviews with about 12 architecture practices and some key policy makers like government architects that we see as leading the way in Australia at the moment in the adaptive reuse field. And we gathered together that for the first essay, those findings, if you like. And we did talk a bit about terminologies about the word adaptive reuse, because we did have some quite interesting debates with some of our interviewees around whether they like that term or whether they don't, but we decided to use it as a recognised term, and it was really defined in the 1970s in the face of economic uncertainties and a global oil crisis. And really then since the turn of the 21st century, it's accelerated as a kind of strand of architectural practice, with government, design and heritage bodies all setting out guidelines on its benefits. So I'm not going to go into terminologies here. There's a lot of other books that do that, include Lillian Wong, Fred Scott, Sally Stone, some fantastic books recently are more around the kind of theory of adaptive reuse, if you like, in an international sense. All these definitions, though, seem to point at a kind of middle way between conservation and demolition, and that's where we need to be operating, if you like. And so we go through the recent history of adaptive reuse in Australia, really, to tell a new narrative, I suppose, again, because we're kind of interested in that from a historical point of view. And then from our discussions and interviews with the architects, we highlighted quite a lot of common ground in terms of their influences and their design strategies. And there was quite a lot of consistency. There's some debate, but around particularly those practices' own sort of influences, and particularly international influences. And we asked them all the same questions. And who did you look at? Oh, sorry. Probably my son saying, "What's for dinner?" Yeah, so they all cite people like Carlos Gupper, David Chipperfield, Lakatan Basal. So it's kind of interesting that there's this kind of stable of people that we all know about, and that they are having influence and impact in Australia. So led by our interview data, we grouped our discussion of their current design approaches around such challenges as exploring the fit between form and function as a key one that they're all dealing with and grappling with as you change function. How practices go about researching and analysing the historical context that they are engaging in, which was really interesting discussion. NMBW, for example, very much engage in deep research about the buildings and the context that they're going to operate on and work within, and how they do that. And that's really important for us as educators as well. And then issues of design authorship. What does authorship and custodianship mean now in this frame of adaptive reuse? And then sustainability kind of policies and tensions and trade-offs that they had very strong views about. And then ways that they are rethinking this fundamental relationship or juxtaposition between new and old work, that junction point in the interventions of these buildings, and other things about expressions of materiality, patina, and so on, as we talked to them about. And I guess provocatively, we sort of conclude this essay with asking, sort of my own preoccupation, asking whether these approaches to adaptive reuse signify that architecture is in fact now sort of post-modern, that we are moving past a modernist paradigm and a dominance of modernism and the reliance on sort of fossil fuel architecture and urbanism. And that is starting perhaps to lose its allure, all in a sort of, albeit uneven and too slowly. But also it's interesting how the excesses of the 1990s and the sort of noughties of star architecture seems to be fading, and we have this kind of new way of operating. And even Rem Koolhaas, famously of OMA, who once famously explained fuck context, has now come to address what he calls preservation architecture much more positively by acknowledging that we cannot return to the excesses of the late 20th century. He says new forms are no longer relevant. Preservation is architecture's saving retreat, and preservation creates relevance without new forms. And that's quite a sort of shift for Rem Koolhaas, and something to unpack at another time. How am I going for time?
Okay.
I'm good, yeah. So we unpack those things. Then we shift gear for the second essay. Professor Rob Crawford, colleague in the faculty, we were very keen to have his involvement, and we were all involved in a failed Australian Research Council bid anyway. So Rob, we wanted him to really outline the sustainability imperatives for adaptive reuse and practical considerations in maximising the environmental and embodied energy gains, and in a way that is very accessible for students, for practitioners, as a sort of demonstration and a way of almost kind of bargaining to your client, to your stakeholder, the benefits of doing this in this way. So he puts together this sort of persuasive set of tools for calculating and demonstrating to stakeholders the environmental value of adaptive reuse. Obviously, it's really complex and to calculate it at an exact and individual level, but he sets out some principles underpinning this presumption and a growing body of research that demonstrates that there's no sustainable route towards the construction sector reaching net zero emissions without drastically curbing new building on greenfield sites, reusing a much greater quantity of materials, and calibrating the reliance on others, including concrete, which currently accounts for about 8% of global CO2 emissions. Many other great books are coming out. One that I often refer to is Pedro I don't know how you say it, Gadanho, I think that's it. His book called Climax Change of 2022, that again issues a provocative challenge to the profession of architecture to lead a new paradigm shift as great as that of the turn to modernism in the first half of the 20th century. And so Rob puts this sort of how-to guide backed by data, and he discusses the embedded value of buildings being material resources, energy and greenhouse gas emissions, infrastructure and utility connectivity. They're all the kind of benefits of working with buildings and sites and places that already exist. And then puts forward other benefits of adaptive reuse practices like the preservation of resources, reducing environmental footprints, reducing construction impacts, reducing waste, and supporting sustainable condensed urban redevelopment. So I'll whiz through. Sorry, these are just a bit random shots from the book of Rob's essay. Then we move to the third essay, and I'm going to not talk about this now, but this is around adaptive reuse, particularly in heritage policy, and it unpicks some tensions between conservation and heritage policy in relation to architectural practice of adaptive reuse. But Cameron will talk around some of this next. The fourth essay, Adapting to New Ways of Working and Living, really examines how, and again, this is already a little bit out of date because we were writing it during COVID pandemic time, and really understanding these shifts, big shifts in the way people are working, the way they're living, and that impacting decisions around possible adaptive reuse scenarios as declining office demands in our cities in Australia as elsewhere in the world. But it still seems like a relevant conversation. You know, working from home seems to have stuck since COVID. So we were kind of interested in looking at examples, particularly where workplaces have been turned into housing and the tensions around that. Some fairly recent examples, there's 180 Water Street in New York of 2017 that's often put forward as a sort of case study in this. And Australian work, we include something like Fender Katsoulides' Alba assisted living apartments, converting office buildings into retirement living in South Melbourne. And we briefly look at issues of how do you calculate the economic value of existing historic building stock and precincts, and the knock-on or proximity effects of this retention of value to neighbouring precincts, including the byproduct of this being urban gentrification. So sort of set of wicked problems within that. Then just briefly, we then go into case studies. We've got 23 or so studies, case studies, fairly recent, not all that recent, mostly award-winning. We really wanted to get a range of different practices, different types of buildings, and we grouped them into various types in these case study sections. And those types, we group them into education, making the civic and the cultural realm, urban living and working, interiority projects that are mainly interiors, and then landscapes and infrastructure projects. No individual houses, as we felt that that's another discussion. And at the head of each of those groups of case studies, we put forward another short essay where I guess Cameron and I, again, from our historical bent, we're trying to put in the story of this prior to the last 10 years to sort of, again, start to build up towards a different way of talking about the history of Australian architecture through adaptive reuse projects from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. I'm going to hand over in a minute, so I'm going to flash through the case studies, but not really say anything about them. But these are all education buildings, Peter Elliott's work and NMBW's work at RMIT. But we're keen to get in this education section all sorts of different education, community education, university, daycare centres, schools. 6 degrees feature quite a lot in the book. Kirsten Thompson's work features a lot. This is a UniMel Stables project. Then buildings for community making and cultural sites, of which there's a lot of significant projects from the 1970s and 1980s of major museums, power station adaptations. There's a lot of seminal Australian work in this category. So fairly recent ones, Broadmeadows Town Hall. Then some major projects in Sydney by TZG, again, really leading practice over many years in this space. In Brisbane, the Brisbane Dance Centre from a shoe factory. And then trying to get some regional work in this work, the Great Cobar Museum by Dunhillam. Looking at sort of urban precincts in cities, interested in the way you knit together small and large redevelopment projects. This is in Fremantle, of a men's hostel project. So we're trying not to get just sort of glitzy cultural centres, but a whole different range of work. I'm just going to whiz through some of these. Collingwood Yards, major redevelopment project here in Melbourne. And then we look at interior spaces, really difficult to choose case studies, but keen to get some. This is West Australian firm Space Agency and Michael Petroni, Dimity Walker have done a lot over 20, 30 years in Western Australia in this space. And then landscapes and infrastructure, some key projects like the Paddington Reservoir Gardens, but then these small insertions, NMBW's Box Hill Gardens and other infrastructure reuse projects. And fantastic project in Tasmania by Gilby and Bruin, the Spring Bay Mill won a lot of awards of converting a wood chip mill into an environmental cultural centre. And then the last part is a sort of edited essay by Kirsten Thompson from her heritage address from some years ago, and really understanding her approach to designing for adaptive reuse. So we were keen to get her voice in there. I think I'm going to stop there so I don't take up any more of Cameron's time.
You see that? You can see that now.
Yep.
Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for having me. Just want to acknowledge I'm here on Gadigal land in Sydney and pay my respect to the traditional owners. And thanks for the invitation to the Retrofit Hub for hosting this event. So I just want to talk about two issues in heritage policy broadly that I think are relevant around most of Australia. I'll draw a fair bit on New South Wales, but the first of them is definitely relevant around all of Australia because it's the extent to which heritage policy is built out of the principles of the Borough Charter, which is a kind of best practice document for Australia and very well regarded internationally, and sort of, the Bible, if you like, for Australian heritage practice. The other is the issue of asset value and how that's become central to the way policymakers consider the question of heritage and its sort of validity and its reusability. And so I just wanted to sort of try and raise the two questions that I think are driving the current issues around what we might do in public policy terms to encourage a more confident and kind of clear take up of adaptive reuse and retrofit. And I'll just finish off by pointing to a recent tool some people in this space might well be aware of, that the property outfit Grosvenor have put out in the UK about some retrofit policy suggestions that seem like they might be on the right track. So many people might know that the kind of central shibboleth of heritage in Australia is Article 3 of the Borough Charter, which counsels a cautious approach of changing as much as necessary but as little as possible. So it's usually described as the cautious approach. And so the question arises always, of course, well, in terms of decision making in heritage is, well, have you done too much, or are you attempting to change too much? And this issue, I think, it's quite vexed in any circumstance, almost in conservation, but particularly so what is necessary and what is as little as possible in terms of an adaptive reuse project. And when we did our interviews, we talked to Ashley Dunn, Dunn Hillam, who Hannah's already mentioned, a firm that's done a lot of work with existing buildings in Sydney and in regional New South Wales. And Ashley said the Borough Charter is an elegant formulation, which that is, that formulation, as much as necessary, as little as possible, is kind of unimpeachable at some level, ethically and environmentally. But he said it's one that provides a lot of room to move in either direction. In other words, it's not always the conservation management process, heritage management process, and the heritage impact process, the two kind of key drivers within the way heritage decision making works in most Australian states, tend to be able to push in one direction or the other around this core principle, depending on the circumstance. And that's kind of right in many ways, but it also brings up some really interesting challenges, and it means there's a lot of decision making to be done by practitioners themselves, and a lot of wiggle room about which way to push, in a sense, with clients and so forth. Worth dwelling, I think, for a second just on to sort of try and draw this out, how it's worked in a way. This is Walsh Bay, a lot of people will know. So you've got Circular Quay over here, and around the other side of the bridge is this set of piers from an early 20th century redevelopment. By the time of containerisation, this is obsolete and is redeveloped ad hoc, with sort of ad hoc inhabitation, and eventually beginning of one renewal of 4-5 in the 80s, and then a large-scale urban project which involves the renewal of the so-called shore sheds, as well as the reconstruction of this one, that's 6-7, and then adaptive reuse of 8-9. Part of what happened in that process was a deal done, in a sense, through the conservation management process, to leave 2-3, this one, as intact as possible, with its interior more or less completely untouched, and the idea being there that would be the sort of strict conservation. And so conservation management in this sense was across the full spectrum over this project, from rebuilding on the same footprint as you had here, to adaptive reuse here, to sort of strict conservation here. Now, that was all very interesting, and it was quite successful in its own way. But 2-3, the strict conservation example, simply sat largely unused for a decade, more than, in fact, ultimately about 2 decades before the New South Wales government decided, okay, we're going to go again, and we're going to find a way to actually get this very large building, really skyscraper volume, really, but just laying down. We're going to bring this into this quite important, strategically significant asset for New South Wales and for Sydney, and a big part of the its waterfront, and we've got a large unused building. So how do we do that? So they developed a strategy at that time, and what happened was that TZG undertook a series of insertions into that building, creating 2 main theatres. This is one of them, Australian Chamber Orchestra performance space, and also a theatre for the Australian theatre for young people, as well as a series of rehearsal spaces. They were able to do at the same time was maintain, I guess, the quality of space that had been strictly conserved through that original conservation action and that strict conservation planning exercise that had been implemented for this particular pier for 2-3. So what you have in a sense is an irony, or in one respect. You say the conservation management framework for this area was, at least as it applied to this pier, arguably too strict. It did not enable the renewal and activation of this building, this fantastic timber building, which had a really interesting history, connected very closely with activity during World War II and a whole range of other and the history of the rise and rise of the wool industry in Australia in particular, where millions and millions of tons of wool move through these things. So there's sort of nationally significant spaces, a huge opportunity in terms of the strategy of the city in terms of renewing cultural assets and so on. But finally, here they came to a position where they said, no, we're going to undo that old cultural management, that heritage management framework, and we're going to allow the insertion of these new theatre spaces, which they did. And I think I point this out or we point this out in the chapter under heritage policy here, is that the ironic bit is that I think arguably the project that occurred between 2018 and 2022, led by Tonkin Zalai Greer, in particular with the leadership of Peter Tonkin on this project, was probably a better realised project than we might have had in the 1990s phase of renewal. Not because necessarily they're better architects or whatever. I just think that in some ways that time, that delay in a sense, that enabled them to realise this project was key to, in a sense, to the realisation of a really good cultural strategy for this building and a really carefully thought out design, which took careful consideration of the existing qualities of the sort of open space, as well as the opportunities to insert meaningful things into it. So I think it's really exceptional. And I think the policy here, it doesn't give us a clear lesson. Should we have done more earlier, or should we have left it? I think in some ways we get good outcomes with conservation when we move slowly, but at the same time, not all, most asset owners are not going to tolerate this in the way the state government did in terms of that holding cost of opportunity cost that's sitting there. Because over the last decade or so, arguably the thing that's been at the centre of heritage policy making has been a shift to concern is how to activate heritage places as assets. And this was really built out of that shift in policy really came out of the Productivity Commission inquiry report from 2006, which led to, which sort of raised a number of points, but the key one I wanted to point to here is that this final consideration in their sort of key points that they made in the summary of the commission findings, which was that the most appropriate time to consider the added costs of conservation and to assess net community benefit would be after the assessment of heritage significance and before regulatory control is applied. This was a shift in Australian heritage policy in that it said you had to be somewhat more future oriented in terms of understanding the costs and asset values. Now, this hasn't always been translated into heritage policy, although some changes to New South Wales Heritage Act in 2009 did say that create some new pathways to the removal of heritage listings, including places being incapable of reasonable economic use and that listings causing undue financial hardship. And that's become a big debate over what the threshold of that might be and what undue hardship might be. Now, in the end, it's difficult to say how to strike a balance, in a sense, between what is necessary under the old Borough Charter principle and, in a sense, what is necessary for an asset to be reactivated, to be renewed and adapted in a meaningful way that we're trying to highlight in the book. But I think it's at the intersection of these two questions that the policy action is, and that we need to be, thinking about how we can, neither sit with that very unimpeachable sort of philosophically sound idea in the Borough Charter, nor simply reduce the whole process to sort of how to activate asset management, because I think the two paths aren't going to work. I think there is new thinking that perhaps open up a third pathway, and I've just been recently coming across this, Retrofit or Ruin report from Grosvenor, which is kind of interesting in its outlook. And I think the key thing that it's sort of suggesting is that there should be a more standardized pathway that's enabling, in particular, environmental upgrades to heritage listed assets. Here they mentioned grade 2 listed assets. For us, I think we could probably look at the kind of local listing layer as a layer where, if we had really strong at state level or national guidance, allows adaptive approaches and particularly sustainability upgrades to buildings that don't require the same lengthy heritage assessment processes that we're accustomed to. And so I think that's something that we should be looking at in a way to avoid either error, if you like, of the cautious approach and its pitfalls, or the kind of asset logics that underpin the Productivity Commission report. Anyway, that's a very quick summary, I think, of the issues, and there's a lot to be unpacked in all of that, but I don't want to take up the whole time, so I'll hand it over.
That's great. Thanks very much, Cameron. We've got Marika in the room. Marika, welcome. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you.
Marika's going to talk about some case studies, as we mentioned, for about 10 minutes or so, I hope. We're a little bit over time, so if you can squeeze it a little bit, that'll be good, but I'd prefer to hear what you have to say than not hear, so yeah, put what you need in there. Are you able to share your screen?
Yes, I think so. And I'll just, okay, so I've just got a couple of projects. I've got two of the projects that are included in the ADAPT publication, and then another one just to sort of expand on the general idea. I'm sort of saying the same thing 3 times, so we'll see what you all think. Oh, you can probably all see. So I did want to just acknowledge and pay respect to both Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, where I'm working now, and I think everybody, oh, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people who are viewing this are from, and also the Wadawurrung peoples, because I'm going to show a project from Geelong. Now, no? Okay. This drawing is quite nice. It's a drawing of a mural at Denny's Place in Geelong that's related to the project I'm going to show you. And it won a prize from this primary school student. And here is the actual mural, which was a part of a Geelong street art project. And we've got King Billy by Cameron Scale and also Chrissy Amphlett, for those who might know Chrissy Amphlett, also mural artwork. And I think that what's good about this is it shows you a sense of the relationship between retrofit projects and also sort of artwork, street activation, and the urban situation. Oops. So I did want to point out something that I feel that I've taken away from the ADAPT book. So I think we're all conscious that circularity and retrofit reuse are obviously interlinked, and my office, NMBW, is always trying to promote to reuse buildings as much as possible. But I think what's quite nice about the book is this idea that it expands even beyond like the bare materials that are reused, to recognize that, and I think this relates to, sorry, I just heard the last little bit of the discussion about the heritage controls, but the activation that is promoted by retrofit is maybe more important than even the building itself. And also in terms of trying to understand how to work with a building, it might be more important to think about that deep character of that existing condition, and how you might be able to retain that deep character, as opposed to having rules about what you should and shouldn't keep. Now, that's obviously requires a fair bit of judgment, and I think that's something that's discussed by Cameron and Hannah. So, two of the buildings that were included in the book, what the first one is RMIT NAS, and I'm happy to say that Brendan was also part of this project.
In another life.
Yeah, in another life. Anyway, that's all very nice. And this project was a collaboration with various people. And I want to note that um, a, it's sort of saying the same thing over and over again, but the building was a difficult and unloved building. So I guess I'm just saying there's a problem. And I'll note that these buildings that we've been working on are generally what's regarded as B grade, C grade, even D grade, as opposed to A grade heritage. We have done the building 1888 at Melbourne University, which I think would be A grade, but a lot of them are just totally just stuffed full of things and nobody's given it any care for a good couple of decades. So a difficult, unloved building, and the I guess the way we approached it was an intensive study of its logic. So just as a first initial slide, just showing you the kind of thing that we were doing at the beginning, which is overlaying everything. So this is like the buildings on Swanson Street as they are, as they were, and also as they were projected to become and never actually happened. So we're sort of trying to understand all of these things at once. And I guess some of the crucial moves related very strongly to understanding that heritage condition. So on the left is the Wolfgang Sievers photo, which showed that unlike what we all think that those buildings are, which is a very sort of internalized kind of space, actually there was quite a lot of externalized parts to the building, and also that these were connecting through all the way to the laneway at Bowen Street at the back. So on the right is our or some of the project, and really this was about trying to reopen up those openings and try and declutter what was there. And a simple another version of this is on the left is the moment of demolition. So what we're trying to do is understand the existing structure and the rhythm and the materiality, and then let that live, I guess, in the proposed new work. So next project is Box Hill Gardens, which we designed with Aspect Studios. So you'll see that the next one is also with Aspect Studios. So we're very into collaboration. Same kind of deal. There's a problem, an underutilized recreation space, and pretty much the same solution, which is a proactive finding and revealing of what could be found, like the let's just say the invisible aspects of what was there. So, for example, one of the types of work we did was to overlay the project, which obviously is here, on top of the historic condition with the existing condition as well. And then what's important, I think, is the landform and the water surface water run. And this building, of course, being part of a park, has a lot of opportunity to relate to how the water might be captured across the ground. And you can see that in these photos that the land is falling. On the left is the historic photo from the 50s. It was a tennis club, and you can see the tennis courts. This was unfortunately, there was unfortunately, I don't know, but the idea of tennis became very not common anymore, and especially you can't really see it in these photos, but there's been huge development at Box Hill where the types of people living there has changed completely. Anyway, tennis isn't in anymore, and we were tasked with providing basically amenities and shade structure and some more usable, more variable sports areas. So I guess what's important is that we took the existing buildings that was there, that was just that one tennis club, and we tried really hard to think through what could be kept in a good way and how to look after all the bricks and reuse them. So you can see instantly that we kept like a sort of characterful amount of the existing building and then sort of, I guess what's important is rethought the bricks that were going to be used in terms of being bricks. So I'll just note that we did manage to look at this is called colonial bond, where you've got this sort of bricks on end and the bricks. Anyway, we're looking at the sort of history and the technique of construction, and then also the materiality of the bricks, which we discovered were actually made in Box Hill, which was a really nice thing to be able to reveal. So I'll just say quickly that during construction, we tried really hard to keep these, the brick-like quality of the bricks. We kept the painted areas, and we also used brick-like techniques to highlight structure, to hold services, to do partition walls. And here's a light fitting with a sort of brick shade structure. So that's that project. And now the third one, which is Geelong Laneways. This is actually quite recent and also designed with Aspect Studios. This one's kind of interesting because it goes from a private shop to a public passage. That means that the City of Greater Geelong and DELP, what's it called now? Anyway, Deca, had to actually purchase a private property and turn it into a public passage. So that's actually a whole lot of interesting things there. But same, so that was, I guess, the problem, and then the same sort of solution of discovering what was there and propping it up, I guess. So here's that King Billy, and just in the beyond, you can see this opened up laneway. And this is from the other end where you're looking through, and you can see that this is a Mallet Street, a pretty heavily populated street, and you can go right through to, actually, I'll just go back for a second. You can get a sense that this is the sort of small street with lots of shops and bars and so on. So it's a very useful connection. So this has been going on, well, you can see here since 2017. This idea had been going on for a long time to try and really break open Geelong and let people really get through from one space to another. So it's seen as an urban problem. So that's really nice somehow that Retrofit can work with this urban problem. So here are all these areas that were being studied to try and open up. And then at the end, there were 10 laneways, and this was the first one to actually happen. So there's an arcade portion and a laneway portion, and Aspect Studios worked mainly on the arcade laneway portion, and NMBW worked mainly on the arcade portion, but we, of course, interacted. So this shows you again this kind of historic study, and I'm now going to flick through quite a few slides showing you the sort of detailed study of the materiality of the area and the greenery of the area, and understanding the slope of the land and how that might feed into watering this area, this building, and the laneway. understanding the sun and how we might be able to get greenery to grow, understanding the character and the potential of laneways and arcades in Melbourne as a comparison. This might relate to the RMIT NAS project as well, just quietly. And this is like the demolition of certain parts. So basically, we went through and removed half of the existing roof and made it translucent to allow sunlight to come down and allow greenery to grow. And then we had to sort of remove every second piece of structure underneath. So here are some model photos of this kind of sense of removal. So this project was almost like a removal project. And then the ground was sort of relaid to be accessible and so on. And basically everything's removed. And then you can find beautiful things, such as this sign. And of course, some things have to be added. And sorry to keep going on about Brendan, but this structure, I want to point out to you, this is this earthquake steel that we had to put in the facades. And then all this kind of steel. So it's really interesting, I think, that once you start removing more and more, then you've got to sort of reinstate structure. So how do you do that? Becomes a new type of question. So this is the existing structure where you can see it, but before it's demolished. And this is the structure that we kept with the cross bracing steel. And it's been quite carefully designed to allow, for example, the possibility of a tree to grow, to allow certain moments of experience as you're walking along. And here is the roof bracing. So you can see the kind of effect that happens from this process. So just pointing out that the capture of the rainwater was like a really important thing, and how it runs along and goes into this green spine of the city. And also that the way that power is revealed is a really important thing to show. And I think it'd be interesting to discuss further to whether you reveal it or not. I know that's a thing that Hannah and Cameron have been talking about.
Marika, I think it sounds like you're sort of coming to the end anyway, but I think we're out of time. But that's fantastic. Just
This
flick
is
through.
the bricks that we've
Yeah.
counted.
Yeah,
That's it.
great. Thanks very much.
I'll stop sharing.
They're really good examples. I love the fact that we're talking about taking stuff away and, key little moves that actually change the nature of a whole neighborhood. So, that's exactly what Retrofit should be doing. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen. And we're going down here and go on this one. Share, we can all see that. Yeah, just very quickly, this is just what's happening around, and we'll have a very short couple of questions. So this is a great scheme from City of Melbourne. Maria put this out this week. So this is Retrofit Melbourne Financial Incentive Scheme. So this is money available for buildings around Melbourne to actually get retrofit. There's 3 activity classes there. One is actually doing some benchmarking to see whether your project's worthwhile in the first place. The next one's to do some design, so action planning of performance improvements up to $7,500, and then finally in construction, so up to $30,000 to contribute to people to upgrade their buildings from a neighbour's point of view. So that's fantastic. That's all on City of Melbourne websites to have a look at. We go. Doesn't seem to be. There we go. The next one is Don't Waste Buildings. So Claire Bowles and the group, really active. Good to see. So this is a building tour down in Brunswick of the Broody building on the 6th of May. Only 20 spots available. So, and we did advertise it, I think, last week. So you might be lucky, but get in touch with them if you're interested in going down there. Really good sessions of walking through a building, talking about the retrofit. And I think they usually go for a bit of a drink and a meal afterwards if people are interested. All of this Enzo is going to be recorded and put up on the website, so you'll be able to pick it back up from there if you like. We might quickly talk about some questions, because there's one in there on the costs of maintenance, which is a really good question that I'd like to hear a bit about as well. Hannah, do you have any idea of research available on the cost of maintenance of existing buildings that might actually help contribute to the argument for retrofit?
Yeah, not specifically on costs. I mean, I guess from more my angle, that in terms of theory in architecture at the moment, there's a huge interest in accounting for maintenance and care of places. But I think that's a really good point. Others have probably got better answer to that than I have.
Yeah. It's just a part of that whole financial equation, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, you know, we forget, but we're still in early days, I think, of retrofit and understanding the value equation around money, carbon, and, you know, social impact and usefulness. We're over time, so if people want to leave, please feel free to leave, but also feel free to stay, because we might just lean on our guest presenters to stay for a little bit to answer a couple of questions. So if interested, hang around. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Oh, sorry, next month, I should say. Last Tuesday of each month, regular. So we'll see you then. But are there any questions around the room here to begin with? I have one, but I'd like to give other people a chance.
Maybe a ceremonious clap as well.
Oh, yes. Well done. Yeah, very good. Yeah, lots of great stuff in there. There are a couple I had, which, I mean, it must have been incredible putting a book together like that. Cameron, Hannah, just wondering, did you get a sense for what the sticking points around retrofit were from people? That, I guess one of the issues is you're looking at successful retrofit projects, and the ones that are interesting to me are the ones that almost made it, or, you know, got a big no stamped on them for some reason along the way. I'm just wondering if you actually heard stories or got a feel for any of that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Cameron, do you want to go?
Oh, well, no, I was just going to say two things very easily. Uncertainty and fire. Would be two big ones. Marie could probably be a better place than either of us to talk about the things that stop projects, because working closely with clients. But in terms of us conducting the interviews and talking to people, yeah, uncertainty. All of the practitioners liked the idea of being able to investigate and think through, just in exactly the way that Marika showed with their projects, that careful observation, the sort of archival on site, and then the process of peeling back and learning, and rather than just ploughing in, obviously, with a demolition plan. And obviously there's a certain amount of uncertainty with that. And this is, I guess, where financial uncertainty meets actual physical uncertainty. And that's where, I guess, the feasibility potentially falls over. But yeah, Marika, I'm sure, is a better place to address that than me.
I think we discussed that actually when we had our first sort of, you know, discussion session before the book sort of really went underway. And I think that that is something that I think is crucial for these sorts of projects, that unlike a building where you can know what's going to happen, it's basically a building where you don't know what's going to happen. And I think there's a very strong effect on time and also workload. So I think this is just something that's not fully understood by clients, certainly, but probably by the general public and within the professions as well. That it's not like doing a renovation, like a house renovation, I think, because, you know, when a long time ago, when you thought that you were doing a house renovation, it was sort of like pull off the back and put a new thing. So that's like a really different thing to this kind of very intricate work that needs to happen, especially for public buildings that have, I think this is well discussed in the book, that there are, basically city councils and so on who are completely and utterly sort of beholden to these buildings that they have to deal with, and yet they don't really have enough money to deal with it. So I think it's, sorry, I'm going a bit off topic here, but I think that it all interrelates because the uncertainty of that existing condition, it almost feels to me like you need a two-part design process where you start by investigating the existing condition, but you probably almost need the final architect to be engaged already. But it's kind of like I guess it's like a feasibility study, but a really particular type of one. So rather than, for example, I don't know, schools or something, you often do a plan of the whole school or, like an urban sort of feasibility or something like that. Or, of course, a financial feasibility that happens all the time for developers. But it's kind of like we need to have this whole extra stage where people work out what the situation is. And that will lower the uncertainty risk factor, and it will sort of make everything basically more clear because you'll have a sense of what it really means for cost reasons or whatever other, or regulatory reasons. And I will say that I completely agree with Cameron about fire. Fire is an unbelievable sort of determinant of some of these buildings, fire safety. So because they're often so old, and the fire safety has been accrued over time, so they're often terrible fire safety kind of scenarios, that's just been, added and added and added. And they just don't make sense from the point of view of the origins of the building. And if you have to pull all that back, then it's a big job to kind of rethink the fire strategy. So that goes together with the whole sense of uncertainty, but that really is a big, big factor, I think. And the final thing I was just going to add was that in terms of the cost of maintenance question, which I think is all interrelated with this fire and everything, I do think that it's pretty hard going for whether it's public or private clients. And I think this is a major question of the book, the ADAPT book. It's pretty hard going to have to fork out the money that is essentially going to be required. So, I think the developers, and I think, a lot of the discussion in the book is about, I guess, reducing heritage controls to make a more let's say, standard approach towards development be possible. But I'm just wondering if it could also go the other way around, where instead of making standard development more possible, you sort of accept that it's not going to be standard, but you have to get more money if that's the case. So I think what I'm sort of saying is, just as you showed some wonderful grant opportunities, Brendan, just before we started this session, I feel like we need some kind of, I guess, an allowance of extra funding somehow, which of course could be through grants. That feels very possible. But I hope that this retrofit forum group can put some leverage onto someone or other to try and make that happen.
We do too, Marika. Yeah, it's interesting hearing your comments around RMIT because a lot of these discussions keep coming back to risk, and I can understand it when you sit with contractors and they say, we love all of your ideas and we want to build all of that, but at the end of the day, we're essentially taking ownership of that building and warranting it for whoever's living in it. So if something goes wrong, no matter what it is, it's not you guys who are paying for it. It's actually us. So I think we need better contractual mechanisms for paying for risk. And RMIT New Academic Street, that was a huge lesson for me because I didn't understand the risk involved in being a structural consultant in a building of that complexity and that level of retrofit. But when you look at it from a big picture point of view, maybe it's about the allocation of risk because all of the consultants, I think, came out of that project probably losing money, including the contractor. And RMIT even, I think, spent a bit more than they thought because they didn't see some of the hazardous material stuff coming. But at the end of the day, that project is a huge, huge success. It avoided shutting down a university campus for 4, 5, 6 years. Financially, that it's just a slam dunk. So RMIT, had a fantastic outcome with that project. It's just that the whole industry was sort of learning on the way through. So I think there's more work to be done on that front. I was really interested in the fire comments. I hadn't realised fire was such a big thing. But the other thing as a structural engineer is the seismic performance, and it surprises me as a structural engineer, and that's because I'm from Australia where we don't have big earthquakes. But it surprises me that these things are quite often not that hard to overcome. So I know with the Housing Commission towers, the two schemes have both come up with solutions for the seismic issues. And usually they're solved by consultants from New Zealand or San Francisco or Japan, where they do have big earthquakes, and they've got a very mature industry, both in design and in construction technology, on how to deal with earthquakes. So again, I suspect there's probably some work to be done around the regulations and a better understanding of risk levels and what you designed to. All right, look, that was really good. We're well over. It's heading on to 5:15, so I'm going to stop there and not ask the other questions I had. Can we just thank our speakers again, Marika, Cameron, and Hannah. And like I said, thanks for those of you who hung on, and thank you for your question on maintenance from Kavita. So there's one more snuck in there on heritage controls.
I'll talk to James.
So Hannah's going to deal with that one offline. Thank you, Hannah.
We can plug. We've got another event with quite a lot of the architects in the book in Melbourne Design Week at Collingwood Yards.
Okay.
In that packed program of Melbourne Design Week, that's massive.
When is that, by the way? That's
in a couple of weeks.
In a couple of weeks.
20th of May.
20th of May.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
If you haven't visited Collingwood Yards, get down there because it's a great project and a chance to experience that as well. And we will see you hopefully next month, last Tuesday of the month, for the next forum. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Enzo.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marika. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, see you, Hannah.